You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, a pretty shocking revelation from Trump himself. He appeared on Hannity's show, and while Hannity was desperately trying to get him to say that he didn't personally rummage through boxes of classified documents that had been stolen from the White House, Trump wouldn't take the bait. Here's a quick clip.
Bring me some of the boxes that we brought back from the White House. I'd like to look at them. Did you ever do that?
I would have the right to do that. There's nothing wrong with it.
But I know you. I don't think you would do it.
Well, I don't have a lot of time, but I would have the right to do that. Right. I would do that. There'd be
All right, let me move on.
Remember this. Yeah. This is the Presidential Records Act. I have the right to take stuff. Do you know that they ended up paying Richard Nixon, I think, $18 million for what he had? They did the Presidential Records Act. I have the right to take stuff. I have the right to look at stuff.
So, Glenn, how bad is this admission from Trump?
It is staggering. Hannity tried to give him the out, and he refused to take it. So what Donald Trump has succeeded in doing is strengthening the obstruction of justice case that is being investigated by special counsel Jack Smith, and strengthening it to the point where the proof beyond a reasonable doubt is there for the taking. And then what was even more surprising is after Donald Trump virtually admitted that, he had his grubby little hands on the documents after those documents had been subpoenaed by the grand jury as part of a criminal investigation, he goes on to helpfully supply evidence of motive of his crime. He says, well, Richard Nixon had documents and they paid him $18 million for those documents. And, in the event there was any question about why Donald Trump had committed these crimes concerning these classified documents, boy, he just answered that question. It was for financial gain. So, this case is virtually ready to be indicted right now.
So on this issue of evidence of motive, before Donald Trump did this, before he came out with this Hannity interview and basically admitted as much, would there have been evidence of motive, or did he just voluntarily hand the prosecution its biggest weapon in this case?
He handed the prosecutors a gift. Motive is something that juries always want to know. What is it that motivated the defendant to commit the crimes? But importantly, motive is not an element of proof. We don't have to prove why somebody committed a crime. We only have to prove that they did commit the crime. But when you have good evidence, compelling evidence of motive, frankly, it makes all of the other evidence a little bit more palatable to the jury because it helps explain, why the defendant did what he did. It makes it a little easier for juries to vote guilty, to hold somebody accountable. And up until Donald Trump virtually announced that my motive regarding the documents crimes was money, I think we would have been left to speculate. Maybe he was going to try to sell documents. Maybe he was going to try to leverage them for some business advantage, perhaps overseas. But now we know it is just sort of this base desire that Donald Trump has to take documents that don't belong to him and sell them back to the government. Richard Nixon did it in his, worldview for $18 million. So why shouldn't I do it as well?
Yeah, it's always amazing how a self-proclaimed billionaire keeps finding creative new ways to try to bilk taxpayers and his own supporters for more money. Glenn, Donald Trump, throughout the entirety of that interview, had said that he has the right to rummage through those documents that he was unlawfully retaining. Does he?
He doesn't. Because, in the first instance, Brian, he stole these documents from the federal government. These were documents that were owned by the federal government and that were supposed to go from the White House once he left the presidency to the National Archives. That's the way it works. Donald Trump didn't have the right to take them in the first instance. He certainly didn't have the right to continue to unlawfully possess them. And whether he was possessing them constructively or actually, constructive possession means you have them in a place that's under your control and that you have access to, like, for example, a storage facility at Mar-a-Lago. Actual possession is you have them in your hot little hands. And jurors like, when you have this kind of a crime, jurors like proof of actual possession, even though it's not necessary. It could be constructive possession. But once the once the ill-gotten goods, once the stolen documents get sort of farther and farther away from Donald Trump, it makes a conviction for possessing those documents unlawfully a little bit dicier, a little bit tougher for the prosecutors to persuade the jury. But he doesn't have the right to possess them. He doesn't have the right to have his hands on them. And he certainly doesn't have the right to continue to retain them after the grand jury issues a subpoena, which is in essence a court order directing that they be returned. So, again, the evidence has gotten stronger and stronger, and all that is left is for Jack Smith to move out, indict Donald Trump for some of these crimes, and frankly, give the Alvin Braggs of the world a little bit of support.
Well, to that exact point, we found out within the last few days that the DOJ has new evidence of obstruction in this very case, coupled together between this Hannity interview and also this new revelation that we found out within the last few days of obstruction. How bad has this case in particular gotten for Trump?
No case is a sure winner. I took a lot of cases to trial. Some of the ones that I thought were fairly strong, I ended up losing, or it ended up in a hung jury and I had to try it a second time. Some cases that, I had my own questions about, is the evidence really there to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest evidentiary standard known to the law? And I ended up winning them. When I assess, through the lens of 30 years standing in the wells of courtrooms arguing to juries, when I assess the strength and the quality of the evidence of obstruction of justice, of unlawfully retaining these classified documents, of compromising national defense information, which is one of the charges that falls under the Espionage Act. The evidence is, I would call it overwhelming, and I don't think that's an overstatement. Any case can be lost, but I kind of feel like this one, a novice prosecutor could go in, present it to the jury, and you're likely to get a conviction.
In fairness, just to kind of play the other side here, what is Trump's possible defense in this case? If you rolled the dice and you got unlucky enough to have to represent Donald Trump in court, how would you defend him in this case?
Really hard. I just don't know that I am creative enough a lawyer to come up with a compelling defense. Before he's made some of these admissions, I would have said, he could have tried to, throw all of his lackeys and flunkies under the bus and say, really, they were the only ones who knew we had these documents at Mar-a-Lago, because I didn't pack up the boxes myself. I never went through them. I didn't know there were classified materials at Mar-a-Lago. But he's blown his own potential defense out of the water. I guess all he can say now is, I honestly and genuinely didn't believe there was anything wrong with possessing these documents. But that's not really a complete defense.
Well, yeah, let me ask you a question about that. Like,
go ahead.
If you commit a crime and your defense here is that you're just ignorant of the fact that you committed the crime, does that absolve you of having committed the crime?
No, you don't need to have specific intent that you're violating the law. You need to know that what you need to be intentionally and knowingly doing what you're doing, even if you don't know the criminal repercussions or the precise laws you might be violating, you can still be guilty. Where specific intent comes in is, for example, if you are charged with assault with intent to kill, it's always easier to use a violent crime hypothetical because I think it's easier to visualize. If you are charged with assault with intent to kill, and the defendant can prove to the jury's satisfaction or can convince the jury, because a defendant doesn't have the burden of proof, that, you know what, I may have engaged in an assault, but there's no way on this earth I was intending to kill the person I assaulted. That was an unintended consequence of what I did. Well, then, frankly, the jury could find the defendant not guilty of assault with intent to kill, because the defendant would have lacked the specific intent that must be proved as part of the crime. But the good news is, good news for accountability, is the jury could convict the defendant of a lesser charge of simply assault, not assault with intent to kill. Donald Trump has no viable defense to the crimes of obstruction and to the documents crimes that Jack Smith is pursuing here.
Yeah, especially again, given the fact that in this very interview he admitted that one possible benefit is that you could get a lot of money by virtue of taking these documents and then suing the federal government for them. Let's finish off with this, Glenn. Given that there is so much evidence in this case, if Jack Smith decides tomorrow that he has all the evidence he needs, he wants to try to get the grand jury to vote on an indictment, while Trump's contending with this New York Attorney General's case, how does that work?
Yeah, so he's already being prosecuted by the district attorney's office, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. If Jack Smith were to bring a federal indictment against Donald Trump, I see those two cases kind of proceeding at the same time. I think what would happen is Donald Trump would make an appearance in federal court in D.C. to be arraigned on the federal indictment, and pretrial motions, hearings would be set, a trial date would be set. Based on everything we know about the system in New York, I have a feeling the federal trial would end up being set and being conducted long before the New York trial, because in New York, they have this sort of robust procedure whereby the defendant can file lots and lots and lots of pretrial motions and litigate them all before he ever makes his way to trial. So, I could see these cases kind of going along on parallel tracks and the federal case actually coming up for trial before the New York case.
Okay, got it. Well, you and I will continue to cover this stuff as soon as it breaks. So for anybody watching, if you want to keep up with this legal news, make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.